Hey guys, are you ready for today's July 13, 2018, 1:21 p.m. Central Time. So this may be a longer video, but you're going to learn a shitload about Brett Kavanaugh, okay? First of all, there's an article an Elite Patriot on Patreon had sent me asking my opinion about how I feel about Brett because of what it contradicted what I said in a video I did for Patreon. I did a video prior to President Trump picking a SCOTUS justice, okay? And I explained the top four people. Amy, Hardiman, Kethledge, and Kavanaugh. Now, Kavanaugh was my pick. I like Brett. I think Brett's excellent. And I'm going to go over some of his prominent cases under a liberal newspaper that hates Brett to kind of prove my point as it be, okay? And some of the rulings, some of you may disagree with, but a lot of people call him a swamp creature because he's been around the establishment, okay? He was under the Bush administration throwing papers around in the White House, big whoop. And then he was nominated to go to the D.C. District Court, which is where he was sitting and is currently sitting. Okay, so he's been around. But the biggest thing to note, okay, first of all, is many SCOTUS picks have been from the D.C. Circuit. And that's actually very important note because D.C. Circuit deals with everything, every topic in the world that becomes in front of them that is important, that has been through other courts already. So they're kind of like the final say of like whether the lower courts were rejects or whatever the fuck it may be. And they take on very difficult cases. So that's why many SCOTUS judges have been picked. Now, the liberals hate Brett for many reasons, and I'm going to show you the article that actually proves my point of why Brett is my pick. And then it turned around later that day, I think it was, that Kavanaugh was indeed picked. They think he's anti-abortion, which is actually incorrect, to be honest with you. And he's for gun rights, which is true. He is for gun rights. Brett Kavanaugh specifically stated during his confirmation hearing for the D.C. Circuit that he would uphold faithfully, as SCOTUS ruled, okay, Roe versus Wade. So they really have a shitty argument there. But when it comes to Roe versus Wade and Casey that came down later on the road, okay, he believes in stare decisis, he believes in current law, and he believes in the Constitution, and he believes in what SCOTUS has already ruled on. So that's where a lot of his rulings have come from. Now, I completely disagree 100% with what Napolitano, who wrote and opinioned this article, for many, many reasons, and I'll go into it in a second. But before I do that, I did a video for my Patreon account talking about the Mexico president being anti-American, and he so is. So I wanted to let you guys know who are on my Patreon account that are going to see this. Mexico moves to lock down its other border wall. Government tries to stem the flow of migrants heading north by tightening its porous southern border. So I thought that was actually interesting because he hadn't really ran on that. And that will truly help the United States. Other than that, he had specifically ran on saying anyone who gets into Mexico, he's willing to just kind of pass through to go to U.S. So anyway, just a side note. So this is filling instead of draining the swamp. This was commentary opinion by Andrew P. Napolitano. Came out Wednesday, July 11th. So I'll scroll down, go through most of it. It says, for example, before the one I have highlighted, social and religious conservatives pushed the president to nominate Amy Barrett, a fiercely Catholic mother of 7 and former Notre Dame law school professor who is a known opponent of abortion. I looked into, after I did that video, because Amy Barrett was confirmed last year to, I don't remember anymore, the 7th Circuit or something. I watched her confirmation hearing just in case she had been the pick. And Amy, the way she spoke and her answers and shit were good, okay? But the problem I had with her, period, is she has less than a year, highly less than a year, of time on the bench. So you truly have no idea what Barrett would do when she would be a Supreme Court justice. That was my biggest issue I had with her, and I had a few other issues with her. Intellectual conservatives pushed for Judge Raymond Kethledge, a philosopher like Justice Gorsuch, okay? Then, I believe Kethledge, I think that was the last guy I wrote about, yeah. Kethledge, first of all, had been overturned. Many of his opinions, his decisions, his dissents, and everything else had been overturned by SCOTUS. So, yeah, I believe it was Kethledge. If not, then it was Hardiman. Maybe it was Hardiman. Anyway, the president's sister, Judge Marianne Trump Barry, had her brother convinced that her colleague, Judge Thomas Hardiman, a blue-collar, diamond-in-the-rough conservative, would fulfill his promise to his base. Actually, I believe it was Hardiman who was overturned by SCOTUS. Either way, the third candidate, whichever man it was, I said he'd be okay. He wouldn't be too big of a deal. I didn't agree with how he felt about immigrants. I thought he was going to be an immigrant sufficer, if you will, and also pro-immigrant and pro-immigration on their side of the argument. But other than that, he would have been okay. I'd have to look back at my document to figure out which one it was who got screwed on SCOTUS all the time. But anyway, it says, but at the last minute, a gaggle of Washington lawyers and lobbyists called the establishment when you agree with them and the swamp when you don't, persuaded the president to reject his commitment to his sister and nominate Judge Barrett Kavanaugh. He is the man Justice Kennedy had asked the president to nominate and is another former Kennedy clerk, okay? So he'd worked for Kennedy for a while. And then it says, as he moves on, he gives examples, okay? For example, now he has given us a nominee to the highest court in the land who typifies the culture he railed against when he claimed he'd drain the swamp. This man, meaning Kavanaugh, and his culture accept cutting holes in the Fourth Amendment because they don't believe that it should be protected privacy. This man and his culture accept unlimited spying on innocent Americans by NSA because they don't believe the NSA is subject to the Constitution. That particular case he is talking about, which is Rand Paul's issue, is that he ruled metadata is A-OK for NSA to collect. I'd have to look back at that case to figure out how he came to that conclusion. But beside the point, moving on. This man and his culture even look the other way in the face of deep state shenanigans against President Trump himself. I do not know what he's talking about because he didn't cite any cases. This man and his culture accept the federal regulation of healthcare and its command that everyone buy health insurance called Obamacare, which is not truly correct. That particular court case, okay, they upheld, I think it was that direction. Anyway, his dissent or his opinion on it was that it could be looked at, okay, the mandate is what he's talking about, that Obamacare had. The mandate could be looked at as a tax, okay, because of how it went through Congress. Now, a lot of articles say that due to that opinion writing by Brett Kavanaugh, that he had convinced Justice Kennedy and Roberts from a distance, which is annoying to think that he would persuade SCOTUS justice, but whatever, to interpret it that way and indeed hold up the mandate, which is what they did. So that's what he's talking about. This man and his culture embrace the Nixonary mantra that if president does it, it is not illegal. Okay, sure, whatever. Not sure what he's talking about there. Other than he was someone who said that a president should not be under investigation during the time for anything he did during the time of his presidency under national security issues and economic crisis. Okay, so everybody's saying that's why Trump nominated him, because he could get out of the Russia investigation. Okay, he was specifically talking about a specific instance which had to do with national security at the time if something major happened and there was an economic crisis. Now, under President Trump, truly that statement isn't even true, because we are not having an economic current crisis if you look around. As far as national security, I think we've had national security problems since 9/11 and perhaps prior. So it says, what happened here? The Kavanaugh nomination is not a question of his qualifications. This is where I highly disagree with Judge Napolitano. And this is why I disagreed with Barrett big time. Because she would rule on how she thought the law should be written, not what the law says, and she would base it on what he's about to say. The Kavanaugh nomination is not a question of his qualifications. It is a question of his values. It is dangerous for judges to embrace values that diminish personal freedom rather than expand it. When they do that, they reveal their view that freedom comes from the government, not from within us. Thomas Jefferson and all the founding fathers profoundly rejected the government as source of freedom argument, but Kavanaugh accepts it. Bullshit, he fucking accepts it. And I'll give you specific instances just in a moment here of what that might be. And it says, I wish the president had nominated a person who believes that as well, but he didn't. Bullshit, Napolitano. The New York Times, a total anti-Kavanaugh, anti-Trump for that matter, people, right? Brett Kavanaugh on issues abortions, guns, climate, and more. This pulls up his major cases. It was actually a well-written article, which is why I'm going over it. And they're going over it because they want everybody to see his record and be like, oh, he sucks, because liberals are the ones who read his shit. Abortion rights. In a case last fall that drew widespread attention, the appeals court voted to allow an undocumented pregnant 17-year-old in immigration detention to seek an abortion without delay. Okay, Judge Kavanaugh dissented. He wrote that while the appeals court was bound to obey Supreme Court rulings that said the Constitution protects women's right to choose an abortion, those precedents left room for the government to apply, quote, reasonable regulations that do not impose an undue burden. Period. That is a true statement. During Roe versus Wade and Casey, the court specifically left out all kinds of shit, saying that it was not an unlimited right. Okay, kind of like how they fucked everyone with the Second Amendment. It's not an unlimited regulated right type of situation. So yes, Brett Kavanaugh will indeed agree with basically every fucking thing, unless it's a horrible case that goes before them. The ACLU is gonna fucking hate themselves for bringing to court these recent court cases they have against states that ruled, like, one of them said they can't have late-term abortions. One of them said you can't have an abortion after 11 weeks or something of that nature. The ACLU has put those into play, and if it makes it to SCOTUS and Kavanaugh is indeed on the court before October, when SCOTUS opens up their fall court cases, and one of them is a court case like that, he will agree with reasonable regulations on abortion, which is why the people say he's anti-abortion. He's just following what the Supreme Court, current precedent, whatever you want to call it, lower courts, and everybody has ruled, which is the open to regulate abortion. So he maintained that the government was within its bounds to choose a transfer to a sponsor instead of, quote, forcing the minor to make the decision in isolated detention camp with no support network available. He went on to say the majority was wrongly intervention, quote, inventing, quote, a new right for unlawful immigrant minors in the United States government detention to obtain immediate abortion on demand. The majority decision represents a radical extension of the Supreme Court's abortion jurisprudence. Okay, period. End of story. He's totally right. That court's decision was so wrong in so many ways because this had to do with an illegal immigrant, and because those court cases under Roe versus Wade and Casey specifically said reasonable regulations that do not impose an undue burden. We as taxpayers just paid for a 17-year-old immigrant to have an abortion, okay? And that is not the way shit works. I don't know where that bitch went. I don't know if she went to Planned Parenthood so they could get around it, saying that the federal government didn't pay for it, but who the fuck paid for it then? So he's totally right in that case. Religion. Here's the deal. This comes to the Affordable Care Act. Okay, in a 2015 case, Kavanaugh dissented with his colleagues. Under the law, employers must provide insurance to the workers or pay a fine. But employers who oppose contraception on religious grounds can bypass the requirement by submitting a form to their insurers, which then covers the workers' contraception at no expense to the employers. Some religious organizations challenge that argument, contending that even submitting the form made them complicit to provide contraception. An appeals court panel rejected their argument, and the full appeals court decided not to hear it over Judge Kavanaugh's objections. Forcing employers to submit the form violated their religious liberty, he wrote. Though he acknowledged the Supreme Court precedent that strongly suggested that the government, quote, has a compelling interest in facilitating access of contraception for the employees with religious organizations, the same outcome could be achieved, he contended, if employers instead only had to notify the government their objections and let the government deal with insurers. In a separate case in 2010, some atheists, this is a great case, challenged that saying a prayer at the presidential inaugurations, the phrase, "So help me God," in the presidential oath of office. A 3-judge panel dismissed the lawsuit, but while the other 2 judges merely said the plaintiffs had no standing, Judge Kavanaugh weighed in on its merits, so they didn't even take it up. He upheld the practice as constitutional, which he should, citing that the government sponsored religious speech or prayer at public events where prayer were traditionally not to violate the First Amendment's prohibition on establishment of religion, so long as the prayers are, quote, not seeking to convert or otherwise explicitive. So he's saying there that as long as they're not trying to make you be part of it, that they're not trying to make you come be part of a cult or something of that nature, you can walk away and not be involved in that situation, and it's a First Amendment right to have those prayers. That's something he decided to just put out into the sphere, okay, his opinion. But the court did not actually take the motherfucking case up. Judge Kavanaugh carved out a more gun-friendly view of the colleagues in a 2011 case arising from a challenge to a District Court of Columbia law that required gun owners to register and banned possession of semi-automatic rifles. While the appeals court upheld the limits as constitutionally permissible under the Second Amendment, Judge Kavanaugh dissented. He wrote that the government may ban fully automatic machine guns. A ban on semi-automatic rifles should be unconstitutional because they, quote, have not traditionally been banned and are in common use by law-abiding citizens for self-defense in the home, hunting, and other lawful uses. He also said that because of registration had not traditionally been required for all lawfully possessed guns, that the rule should be struck down too. There's actually something really specific he said during that case that I did a screenshot of, and I shared with somebody on Twitter. This is actually what he said, part of it, which was excellent. He said, the ban on semi-automatic rifles was unconstitutional because the weapons were in common use in the country, which is a very specific legal term that has been used over and over again, meaning common use. Quote, as one who was born here, grew up here, in this community in the late 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, and has lived and worked in this area almost all my life, I am acutely aware of gun, drug, and gang violence that has plagued all of us. But our task is to apply the Constitution, the precedents of the Supreme Court, regardless of whether the result is one we agree with, as a matter of first principles or policies, which is exactly what I disagreed with 100%, talking about Napolitano questioning his values. His values and what he feels and what he perceives to be correct, okay, or whatnot, should not be part of how he rules. He has specifically ruled consistent with precedent, with SCOTUS, current law, Constitution, and everything else. People may not like what has come out of that, perhaps, but he has been consistent and has never been overruled per se. In fact, the SCOTUS agreed with him on the case he didn't take up, that what he has said is true. Here's another one. Presidential control of agencies. A lot of people didn't like this one. In a 2008 case, the appeals court upheld the structure of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, whose members were appointed by the Securities and Exchange Commission and could only be removed by SEC for a good cause. But Judge Kavanaugh filed a dissent, saying it, quote, effectively eliminates any presidential power to control, end quote, the board's regulatory and law enforcement functions. The Supreme Court later partially agreed with him, voting 5-4 to strike down the limitations on firing members of the board, but not the appointing provisions, which I agree with. They should be able to appoint their people. But as far as firing people for, quote, good cause, okay, if someone sucks ass at their fucking job, okay, good cause and sucking ass at your job doesn't necessarily coincide. So that person has been able to keep their job because they suck. And they can't prove, unless they've done something unlawful or whatever, that it's technically for good cause. That was a huge dispute during this case. And earlier this year, his appeals court upheld a law that limits presidential discretion to fire Consumer Financial Protection Board's director, who has fixed a 5-year term and may be removed only for good cause. Judge Kavanaugh filed a dissent, arguing that it was unconstitutional to give the director that much independence from the White House control. I 100% agree with that, because that person works for the government and was appointed by a president, okay? He wasn't appointed, or she, I think at that time, she was not appointed by Trump, okay? Just like Comey wasn't appointed by Trump, but works for Trump. Anyone who's nominated to be in a position for by the president for any agency or any cause, okay, the fucking White House should be able to say, go fuck yourself anytime they want. I agree with Judge Kavanaugh's dissent. It is consistent with how things have been used, ruled, precedent, all kinds of shit. The way the court ruled in that was totally wrong. Terrorism detainees. Now, there's a situation, there's a 2014 situation, or no, a 2016 case that somebody on my Twitter account didn't appreciate, but that's just true. It's just true. It says, several important cases brought by Guantanamo Bay detainees. Judge Kavanaugh generally sided with the government in habeas corpus cases. Go figure. For example, he broadly interpreted the military's power to hold people in wartime detention even when their evidence of their suspected ties to terrorism is relatively weak. Now, those included a 2010 case in which he was part of a 3-judge panel that kept a Yemeni detainee in custody, reversing a lower court's judge's order. The case established a precedent that courts should consider an array of evidence, even if each individual piece would be dubious when viewed in isolation. The approach made it much harder for detainees to win habeas corpus cases. Fucking good. Fucking good. This has to do with specifically people who go to Guantanamo Bay that are from outside the United States and are not U.S. citizens. You have to read the case. The NDAA that said under Obama that they can detain and keep forever an American citizen does not apply in this fucking case. You have to look it up. He's talking about that entire 3-judge panel was talking about people who made it to Gitmo, okay, through military means, mind you. Not the government sent them there, just some random person like the FBI or CIA. In the military's power, when they were brought there, they could be held and their habeas corpus rights would fucking go fuck themselves. They would not have. Now, this is the one that somebody disagreed with. In a military commissions issue, he argued in 2014 dissent that the appeals court had no jurisdiction to hear challenges brought by defendants before the tribunal issues a final judgment. True. I feel that's true based on precedent. In a colluded 2016 case, this is the case they had an issue with, upholding a defendant's conviction on a charge of conspiracy. Even though conspiracy is not an internationally recognized war crime, he went further than the reasoning of some of his colleagues, writing that international law cannot be enforced in court as a constraint against which Congress and the president do tribunals. Duh! Okay? Because we don't, in our system, okay, deal with tribunal type shit that has to do with international law. Had he not in that court not upheld those charges of conspiracy, there'd be nothing to fucking try this motherfucker for in the United States when he is in the United States custody. Okay, voting rights. In October 2012, Judge Kavanaugh was part of a 3-judge panel that scrutinized a South Carolina law generally requiring voters to present government-issued photo identification in order to cast a ballot. At the time, Voters' Rights Act required jurisdictions with a history of discrimination like South Carolina to receive federal permission before charging election rules to ensure the modifications would not disproportionately suppress minority turnout. The Supreme Court gutted the safeguards the following year, which unfortunately is the case. But anyway, the Justice Department has blocked South Carolina from enforcing its law, noting that about 6 to 8% of African American voters in the state lacked a photo ID as compared with 4% of white voters. They came to that conclusion at SCOTUS based on discriminatory law. Okay, it had nothing to do with what Kavanaugh's situation was. They went further. The Justice Department went further in that case to add that fucking shit. I remember this. Kavanaugh's panel blocked the state from enforcing its law for that year's election, but upheld its use in future ones to allow time to educate voters with the requirement or about the requirement. Judge Kavanaugh wrote that he was satisfied with South Carolina's officials' promise to make exceptions for voters who gave a reason for having no photo ID, saying the law, quote, does not have the effect that some expected and some feared. Okay, moving on. Climate and business regulations. This was something that people could have a hissy fit with. It said in a variety of cases he has been less than willing than his colleagues to decide the agencies had power. This is anti-government. Go figure. Oh, he's for the government. He's for the government to regulate all your shit. That's not true. This is a great case to say that for. regulated topic that Congress has not anticipated. Last year, he dissented from a ruling upholding the Obama-era FCC's net neutrality rules for the internet, which telecommunication firms opposed. Should he have done that dissent? Yes, because the FCC, regardless of whether people liked how Obama ruled on net neutrality, which was actually a decent, good thing, but a lot of people say it's not. It just depends on which side of the fence you're on. Okay, he ruled correctly. His dissent was ruling correctly, because FCC and any other commission, for example, the Environment Protection Agency, he's basically saying what I've been saying for fucking years, that any agency, whether it be from the IRS, ATF, the EPA, the FCC, the IRS, the SSA, all these agencies who commit crimes, as far as I'm concerned, creating rule changes that affect law, getting around Congress, is illegal. And that's what he is saying and upholding. In a 2012 case, it's totally true, in which the appeals court panel upheld certain Obama-era greenhouse gas regulations. For example, Kavanaugh dissented, arguing the EPA had exceeded the authority Congress had granted it, period. The task of dealing with global warming is urgent and important, but a court's assessment of an agency's compliance with statutory limits does not depend on whether the agency's policy is good or whether the agency's intentions are laudatory. Duh! That's exactly how he should have ruled. However you feel about global warming or whatever any other agency does, including the IRS, who pushed off Obamacare's mandate all on their own, not using Congress, even though that was a good thing for everybody, should have been dismissed and should have been brought to court. But it helped people, so nobody brought it to court. These types of things should not be able to happen. Congress did not grant any agency to pull the shit they're pulling. In a 2010 case, campaign finance limits, Judge Kavanaugh wrote the opinion for a 3-judge panel that upheld limits on contributions to political parties, or so-called soft money, which has been imposed in the 2002 campaign finance reform law. However, that may not say much about how he would rule as a Supreme Court justice. End quote. We'll move on, because that's their opinion in this article. In a 2011 case challenging a law that barred, this is so obvious, this falls under every fucking law that has to do with foreigners if you look it up. Challenging a law that barred foreign nationals who are lawfully but temporarily inside the U.S. from spending money on campaigns. Judge Kavanaugh upheld the restriction. Go figure, he followed precedent. And Constitution, how the Constitution has been written to a degree too. But he has construed it narrowly as applying only to spending for ads that expressively advocate that people vote for or against a particular candidate. His interpretation suggested he may be more skeptical about legal limits on spending on ads that discuss issues without explicitly urging people to vote in a particular way. That's what he said in the opinion, but that doesn't mean that changed the outcome of the fact he upheld the restriction, saying that, hey, foreign nationals can't fucking take their money and put it into the United States campaigns for any election. That is a current law that was made by Congress. That's what the cases that are actually really prominent. The New York Times did an excellent layout of them, and they laid them out for liberals. And that's what's so funny. That article was saying Brett Kavanaugh sucks ass, and this is why. Actually, if you look at it, Brett Kavanaugh did exactly what he was supposed to do. There were certain cases people don't agree with. Like, for example, the Obamacare mandate. He just wrote a dissent. It had nothing to do with the actual case itself, saying that it could be considered a tax because of how Congress wrote the law. It went to SCOTUS. Apparently, he fucking influenced 2 judges by that that fucking opinion. It wasn't even a dissent. It was an opinion. Okay? That's bullshit. That's total, like, thought police, okay? Like, his opinions and everything else shouldn't matter to any judge. It's the rulings that matter to the following court, okay? That's what that takes into law. People didn't like how he ruled against that fucking person that had to do with terrorism, okay? Talking about the conspiracy charge. They didn't appreciate that. There's a lot of things people don't appreciate about Kavanaugh because they didn't think he ruled correctly, value-wise, morally, or how the law should be written but is not. Period. Not good enough for me. Kavanaugh followed the Constitution, precedent, everything. SCOTUS ruling. He's very specific on how he writes his opinions, his dissents, and his agreements. And I love Brett Kavanaugh. There is nothing I have seen in his record so far, because he's written hundreds of opinions and been parts of hundreds of cases. He had thousands and thousands of papers that Congress is going to have to go through to figure out what they hate about this guy. Liberals, of course, the whole fucking New York Times just laid out an argument for liberals, but it laid out a positive argument for people who believe in the Constitution, precedent, everything. Anyway, that's this video. This is Are You Ready For It? Take care, guys. Have a great day.